The first thing people noticed about the Seabrook Guesthouse was its silence. It rested on the edge of a quiet American coastal town where the ocean seemed content to whisper instead of roar. Tall cedar trees surrounded the old building, their branches swaying gently beneath a gray afternoon sky. The air carried the scent of rain and salt water, mixing with the faint fragrance of old pine that drifted from the wooden walls. It felt like the kind of place where forgotten memories waited patiently for someone brave enough to face them. I had chosen it for exactly that reason. 3 months of impossible deadlines had left my mind exhausted, but work was only part of the reason I came. The truth was much harder to admit. I had spent the last 4 years pretending I had healed from a heartbreak that had quietly reshaped my entire life. Friends believed I had moved on. My coworkers thought I simply preferred being alone. Even I had started believing my own excuses. But loneliness has a strange way of revealing itself when the world finally becomes quiet. The elderly owner greeted me with a warm smile as she handed over an old brass key. "You're our only guest this weekend," she said kindly. "You'll have all the peace you could ask for." I smiled politely. Peace. It sounded wonderful. It also sounded frightening. Sometimes silence speaks louder than crowds ever can. Room 12 waited at the end of a narrow hallway. The wooden floor creaked beneath every step, not with annoyance but with age, as though the building enjoyed reminding visitors that it had witnessed countless stories before theirs. When I unlocked the door, I stopped for a moment just to breathe. The room felt like another lifetime. Soft cream-colored walls, a stone fireplace, a wide bed covered with a handmade quilt, books stacked neatly beside an old rocking chair, large windows overlooking the restless sea. And beside those windows hung long dark blue curtains that reached almost to the floor. Rain began tapping gently against the glass. For the first time in months, my shoulders relaxed. I unpacked slowly, placing my camera on the desk and my favorite novel beside the bed. There was no schedule waiting for me, no phone calls, no meetings, no expectations, only the sound of rain and the steady rhythm of distant waves. Maybe this was exactly where broken people came to remember how to breathe. That evening I walked along the shoreline until the sky turned silver with mist. Couples wandered hand in hand, families laughed as children chased seagulls, and older neighbors greeted one another by name. Watching them stirred something inside me that I quickly pushed away. Some lives looked so effortless. Mine had stopped feeling that way years ago. Back inside the guest house, I lit the fireplace and sat quietly with a cup of tea. Flames danced across the stone, filling the room with gentle warmth. My phone buzzed twice before I finally turned it off completely. No one needed me tonight. For once, I wanted that to be true. After an hour of reading, I decided a hot shower might finally wash away the tension clinging to my shoulders. Steam quickly filled the small bathroom. The warm water eased muscles I hadn't realized were aching. For several peaceful minutes, there was nothing except the sound of falling water and the comforting thought that tomorrow didn't have to be planned. When I stepped back into the bedroom with a towel around my waist, the room felt unusually still. Too still. I reached for a clean shirt from my travel bag. Something shifted. Tiny movement. Barely noticeable. Near the curtains. I froze. Perhaps it was only the breeze. The windows were closed. My heartbeat slowed for one hopeful second before another gentle movement rippled through the heavy fabric. Not the wind. Someone was behind the curtain. Every muscle in my body tightened. My chest felt suddenly cold despite the warmth of the fire. Old memories arrived without permission. A locked apartment. A message discovered too late. Promises that had quietly fallen apart. The terrible realization that trust could disappear in a single ordinary afternoon. I swallowed hard. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer. The curtain moved again. Fear quickly turned into anger. I know someone's there. Still nothing. I stepped backward until my hand found the heavy fireplace poker resting beside the hearth. I said, "Come out." Several endless seconds passed. Then, very slowly, a pair of worn work boots appeared beneath the curtain. A man stepped forward. He couldn't have been much older than 30. His dark brown hair was slightly messy, as though he had only just woken up. A faded flannel shirt was covered in fine sawdust. His hands looked rough from years of honest work, and his face carried an expression I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not arrogance, only complete embarrassment. "Oh no," he whispered almost to himself. His eyes widened the moment he realized what the situation looked like. I'm so sorry. Who are you?" "My name's Silas." His voice shook. "I wasn't trying to scare you. You were hiding behind my curtain." "I know. Why?" He rubbed the back of his neck before answering. "I was repairing the window frame this afternoon. Mrs. Harper thought I'd already left and locked the room. I stared without speaking. I waited for her to come back," he continued quietly. "I sat down to rest for a minute." He gave an awkward, almost helpless smile. "I guess I fell asleep." Silas listened with genuine interest, even though he had probably heard every story before. After breakfast I stepped outside, planning to walk along the shoreline before the rain became heavier. To my surprise, Silas was already loading tools into the back of an old pickup truck. He noticed me approaching. "I'm fixing a fence near the lighthouse," he said. I nodded. "Busy day." "Always." He closed the toolbox. "But I like working with wood." "Why?" He rested one hand against the truck. "Because broken wood doesn't lie." I frowned slightly. He smiled. "You can see exactly where it's cracked. And people? They're harder." The breeze carried silence between us. "I think people hide damage because they're afraid nobody will stay if it's visible." His words lingered long after he climbed into the truck. I watched him drive away until the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees. Later that afternoon, I wandered into the town's only bookstore. The scent of old paper immediately welcomed me. As I searched the shelves, a familiar voice spoke behind me. "I had a feeling I'd find you here." I turned. Silas held 2 books in one hand. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged. "You looked like someone who reads when the world gets too loud." I couldn't argue with that. We spent nearly an hour browsing shelves without any pressure to keep talking. Sometimes we discussed novels. Sometimes we simply stood beside one another, reading the backs of books in comfortable silence. Felt strangely easy. No pretending. No performing. No awkward effort. When I selected a collection of classic American poetry, Silas smiled. "I almost bought that." "You like poetry?" "I like honest words." He looked toward the window. "They're harder to find than people think." Outside, rain began falling harder. The bookstore owner sighed. "Looks like another storm." Silas glanced toward the door. "My truck's parked across the street. So is my car." He laughed. "I guess we're both getting soaked." We ran together through the rain. By the time we reached the sidewalk, we were laughing like children trying to outrun the weather. My jacket was completely wet. His hair clung messily across his forehead. For one brief moment, the weight I'd carried for years became lighter than the falling rain. As we reached our vehicles, neither of us opened the door immediately. Instead, we stood beneath the gray sky listening to water strike the pavement. Silas finally broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why did you choose this town?" I hesitated. There were dozens of easy answers. Vacation, photography, rest. But none were true. I needed somewhere nobody expected anything from me. He studied my face for a second before nodding. "I understand." "You do. I came here 6 years ago." He smiled faintly. "I wasn't looking for work." "What were you looking for?" He looked toward the ocean before answering. "A place where nobody knew who I used to be." The sentence ended there. No explanation followed. No details. Yet somehow I understood more from what he didn't say than from what he had. Everyone carried something invisible. Some burdens simply became easier to hide with time. We said goodbye and drove in opposite directions. That evening, I sat alone beside the fireplace again. The room hadn't changed. Neither had the curtains. But they no longer reminded me of fear. Instead, they reminded me of an awkward man covered in sawdust who had apologized more times than necessary. I picked up my phone without thinking. Before I could change my mind, I sent a short message to the number Mrs. Harper had written down after asking whether I might need Silas if anything else in the room needed repairing. "Thank you for being kinder than I deserved yesterday." Several minutes passed. Then the screen lit up. We're all carrying something heavy, Rowan. Sometimes kindness is simply recognizing the weight in someone else's hands. Sleep well. I read the message 3 times. Outside, the rain finally stopped. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering what it might feel like to know someone slowly, without fear rushing every moment. I didn't realize it then, but the curtain had never been the real barrier between us. The real barrier had always been the walls I had quietly built around my own heart. It doesn't appear one morning like sunlight breaking through clouds, suddenly making everything warm again. Healing is quieter than that. It hides inside ordinary days. Inside cups of coffee shared without hurry. Inside long walks where silence no longer feels frightening. Inside small promises that are never spoken aloud because they are already being kept. 3 months passed after our conversation at the lighthouse. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. The cedar trees surrounding Seabrook Guesthouse wore shades of gold and deep amber before finally surrendering their leaves to the wind. The ocean became calmer, reflecting pale winter skies that stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. I had planned to stay only 1 weekend. Instead, I rented a small cottage overlooking the harbor. Work continued remotely. My camera slowly filled with photographs that no longer captured loneliness. Instead, they captured moments. Real moments. A lighthouse glowing beneath the first snowfall. Mrs. Harper laughing while flour dust covered her apron. The old bookstore cat sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. And Silas, sometimes repairing a porch. Sometimes reading beneath an oak tree. Sometimes simply standing beside the sea with his hands in his pockets, watching another sunset. I never asked him to pose. The best photographs never needed permission. Life found its own gentle rhythm. Every Saturday morning, we visited the farmer's market before stopping at the bakery. The woman behind the counter no longer asked what we wanted. She already knew. 2 coffees. 1 cinnamon roll. 1 blueberry muffin. Silas always claimed he preferred the muffin, then quietly stole half of my cinnamon roll anyway. You planned this. I absolutely did. You should feel guilty. I don't. His smile remained impossible to argue with. Some mornings began with laughter. Others began with comfortable silence. Both felt equally precious. One chilly afternoon, we finished repairing the old bench overlooking the cliffs. Silas stepped back to admire our work. It'll probably last another 20 years. I ran my hand across the smooth wood. You always say that. Because I build things to stay. The words settled softly between us. He wasn't talking about the bench anymore. Neither was I. Without thinking, I slipped my hand into his. He looked down for a moment before gently tightening his fingers around mine. No dramatic music. No audience. No grand confession. Just 2 people standing beneath a gray winter sky. Sometimes love speaks most clearly through the quiet decision not to let go. December arrived with colder winds. The guest house held its annual holiday gathering for the town. The dining room glowed with candles and evergreen decorations. Children decorated cookies. Neighbors exchanged handmade gifts. Someone played old Christmas songs on a worn piano near the fireplace. Mrs. Harper insisted everyone write 1 wish on a small paper star before hanging it on the tree. What did you write? Silas asked. If I tell you, it won't come true. I don't believe that. I know. So? I smiled. No. He laughed. What about yours? He looked toward the tree. I wished for more ordinary days. That's all. He nodded. I spent years believing life had to be extraordinary to matter. He glanced at me. It doesn't. I've learned ordinary days become extraordinary when you spend them with the right person. I couldn't answer. Not because I disagreed. Because my heart was already saying everything words couldn't. A week before Christmas, Naomi returned to visit. She looked at Silas, then at me. Finally, she folded her arms. So, she smiled knowingly. You both look happier. Silas laughed. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with functioning eyesight. We all laughed together. Later, while Silas helped Mrs. Harper carry decorations into the attic, Naomi nudged my shoulder. You know. I haven't seen you this peaceful in years. I looked toward the kitchen doorway where Silas was carefully balancing a box of ornaments. I don't think he fixed me. Naomi smiled. He wasn't supposed to. I nodded slowly. I think. I paused. He simply reminded me that I was never as broken as I believed. She squeezed my arm. The right people usually do. A few days later, snow began falling for the first time that winter. Tiny white flakes drifted quietly across the beach. Silas called early that morning. Put on your boots. Why? No questions. 20 minutes later, we stood outside the guest house. Mrs. Harper handed us an old wooden sled. I found it in storage. You two look like you could use an adventure. Silas laughed. We're probably too old for this. Mrs. Harper winked. That's exactly why you should do it. We spent the afternoon laughing like children as we walked snowy hills overlooking the sea. At one point, I lost my balance and fell backward into the snow. Silas reached down to help me. Instead, I pulled him down beside me. He looked completely offended. You planned that. I absolutely did. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Snowflakes landed gently on our coats. The world felt wonderfully quiet. I used to think happiness had to be earned, I admitted. Silas turned his head toward me. What changed? You. He smiled. No. You changed. I just happened to be standing nearby. On New Year's Eve, we returned to the lighthouse. The same bench. The same cliffs. The same endless ocean. Only this time, everything felt different. I brought something, Silas said. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me another folded piece of paper. It was the letter, the one he had written weeks before. I think you're finally ready to read it. I unfolded it carefully. Every word carried the quiet honesty I had come to know so well. There were no dramatic promises, no impossible declarations, only simple truths, that he admired my kindness even when I couldn't see it, that my laughter had slowly become his favorite sound, that he never expected perfection, only honesty. By the time I reached the final sentence, tears blurred the page. It read, "If life ever gives us another ordinary morning together, I hope we never take it for granted." I folded the letter carefully. You really never stopped believing in us. Silas looked toward the sea. I believed in you. There was a difference. The first morning of the new year arrived clear and bright. Without saying anything, we walked together toward Seabrook Guesthouse. Mrs. Harper greeted us warmly before disappearing into the kitchen, pretending she had important work to do. She knew exactly why we had come. We climbed the familiar staircase. Room 12 stood exactly as I remembered. The fireplace, the rocking chair, the old wooden floor, the wide window overlooking the ocean, and beside it, the long blue curtain. I walked toward it slowly. Months earlier, that curtain had hidden a frightened stranger. It had also hidden my own fear. Silas joined me beside the window. Funny, isn't it? What is? I spent so long thinking this room was where everything went wrong. He smiled gently. It was actually where everything began. I reached for the edge of the curtain. For a brief moment, I simply held the fabric in my hand, remembering the fear, the misunderstanding, the apologies, the conversations, the laughter, the tears, the long road back to trust. Then, with a slow breath, I pulled the curtain completely open. Morning sunlight flooded the room. Golden light spilled across the wooden floor, warming every quiet corner. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass, calm and endless beneath the winter sky. I looked at Silas. He smiled the same gentle smile that had first made me question whether kindness could still exist in the world. This time, I didn't question it. I believed it. Because trust isn't built in extraordinary moments. It's built through hundreds of ordinary ones. Through showing up. Through listening. Through staying. I slipped my hand into his once more. He squeezed it gently. Neither of us needed to say anything. The silence between us had finally become what it was always meant to be. Home. As we left the room together, I looked back one last time. The curtain moved softly in the morning breeze. Not as a warning. Not as a reminder of fear. but as a quiet symbol that every closed heart can open again, given enough patience, honesty, and love. Some people enter our lives by accident. Others remain because they choose to stay. And sometimes the greatest love story doesn't begin with perfect timing or grand promises. Sometimes it begins with an awkward misunderstanding, a kind apology, and two lonely hearts brave enough to believe that tomorrow can be gentler than yesterday. If this story reminded you that hope can return, even after heartbreak, carry that feeling with you. And if you've ever found healing in an unexpected place, know that you're not alone. Somewhere, another ordinary morning may already be waiting to change your life. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The room was still wrapped in darkness, except for a thin ribbon of pale blue light stretching across the horizon beyond the window. The ocean looked calm for the first time since I had arrived, its surface reflecting the quiet promise of another day. I found myself wondering if Silas was already awake. The thought caught me by surprise. Only 3 days earlier, he had been nothing more than the stranger behind the curtain. Now, without meaning to, I had begun measuring the mornings by whether I might see him. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it simply made me smile. After dressing, I carried my camera toward the beach. The town still slept. Only a few fishermen prepared their boats while gulls drifted lazily above the water. The cool breeze smelled of salt and cedar, and every breath felt cleaner than the one before. I raised my camera toward the sunrise. Just as I pressed the shutter, another click echoed beside me. I turned. Silas lowered an old film camera and laughed softly. I guess we had the same idea. You take photographs? Only when I want to remember something. I looked at the worn camera in his hands. It looks older than both of us. My grandfather gave it to me. Does it still work? Most days. He grinned. Kind of like me. I couldn't help laughing. We walked along the shoreline together, speaking only when silence invited us to. Neither of us seemed interested in filling every quiet moment with words. That was becoming my favorite part of knowing him. Around most people, silence demanded an explanation. Around Silas, silence simply existed. Comfortably, naturally, as though neither of us needed to prove anything. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Harper asked if someone could help repair the old garden fence before another storm arrived. I'd appreciate an extra pair of hands, Silas said. Before thinking too much about it, I volunteered. The fence surrounded a small flower garden behind the guest house. Years of wind had loosened several wooden posts, leaving gaps where climbing roses had begun creeping through. Silas handed me a pair of work gloves. You ever repaired a fence? No. Perfect. I frowned. Perfect. I won't have to correct bad habits. I laughed. So I'm starting from zero? We all do. The work was slow. He explained each step patiently. How to steady the post. How to measure carefully before cutting. How to let the wood guide the saw instead of forcing it. I made mistakes. Several of them. Each time I apologized. Each time he simply smiled. It's only wood, Rowan. But I messed it up. So we'll fix it. His calmness felt unfamiliar. Grant had never been cruel. He simply expected perfection. The smallest mistake often earned a disappointed sigh that lingered longer than spoken criticism ever could. Standing beside Silas felt different. Failure wasn't something to hide. It was simply part of learning. Hours passed almost unnoticed. By evening, the fence stood stronger than before. Mrs. Harper clapped happily. It looks wonderful. Silas wiped sawdust from his hands. Couldn't have done it without Rowan. I shook my head. I mostly handed you tools. You stayed. He said it so casually that I wasn't sure he realized how deeply those two words settled inside me. You stayed. No one had thanked me for staying before. The following days settled into an easy rhythm. Breakfast, morning walks, coffee at the little bakery downtown. Afternoons exploring quiet streets lined with weathered houses and flowering gardens. Sometimes we spoke for hours. Sometimes barely at all. Neither felt wrong. One afternoon we wandered into the small public library. The building smelled of old paper and polished oak. Silas disappeared between the shelves before returning with a stack of mystery novels. You read these? They remind me people eventually find answers. What if they don't? He smiled gently. Then maybe they weren't asking the right questions. I considered that longer than I expected. Perhaps I had spent years asking why someone left. Maybe the better question was why I had convinced myself everyone eventually would. That evening we carried sandwiches to the lighthouse overlooking the cliffs. The sky burned orange as the sun slowly disappeared beyond the ocean. Neither of us touched our food immediately. The view seemed more important. "It's beautiful," I whispered. Silas nodded. "I come here whenever life gets noisy." I glanced toward him. "But it's always quiet here." He smiled. "Exactly." The wind lifted a strand of hair across his forehead. Without thinking, I almost reached out to brush it aside. My hand stopped halfway. I quietly lowered it again before he noticed. The moment passed. Still, my heart refused to settle afterward. Over the next week, something changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just enough to notice. I caught myself looking for his truck outside the guest house, listening for his footsteps in the hallway, wondering what book he might recommend next. It wasn't love. At least not yet. It was something gentler. The comfort of knowing someone else's presence could make an ordinary day feel less lonely. One rainy afternoon we found ourselves trapped inside the bookstore while another storm rolled across town. The owner smiled. "Looks like you'll be here a while." Silas wandered toward the poetry section. "I found something." He handed me a slim collection of poems. Inside the cover someone had written in faded blue ink, "Some people arrive quietly, yet change the entire landscape of your heart." I read the sentence twice. Silas watched me carefully. "I thought you'd like that." "I do." Neither of us mentioned why. That night, as rain drummed against the roof, we played chess in the guesthouse lounge. I lost 3 games in a row. "I think you're cheating," I said. Silas looked offended. "I am deeply hurt." "You should be. I've spent years mastering this game." "Clearly." He leaned back, laughing. "You know what your problem is?" "I have many. You keep protecting pieces you've already lost." I looked down at the chessboard. My smile slowly faded. The sentence wasn't about chess anymore. Silas noticed immediately. "I'm sorry." "No." I looked at the scattered pieces. "I think you're right." Neither of us spoke again until the game ended. The next morning, my phone rang while I was drinking coffee alone. The screen displayed a name I hadn't seen in months. Grant. My stomach tightened. I let the phone ring until it stopped. A few seconds later, another call came. Then another. I silenced the device. When I looked up, Silas was standing near the doorway carrying a toolbox. "You okay?" For a moment, I almost told him everything. About Grant. About promises. About the apartment we had once searched for together. About the message that ended everything. About how betrayal doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives politely, quietly, almost gently. Instead, I slipped the phone into my pocket. "Wrong number." Silas studied my face. Not suspiciously, just carefully. The way someone notices clouds gathering long before rain begins. He nodded once. "If you ever want to talk." His voice remained soft. "You don't have to carry everything alone." I forced a smile. "I know, but I wasn't ready. Not yet." Some stories feel too heavy to place into another person's hands, especially when you're still afraid they'll decide to put them down. Later that afternoon we walked through a weekend farmer's market filled with music, handmade crafts, and fresh flowers. Children laughed nearby. An older couple danced slowly beside a street musician without caring who watched. Silas smiled as he watched them. "I hope I'm like them someday." The dancing part? The staying part? His answer caught me off guard. He noticed my expression. "My parents were married for 40 years. They must have loved each other." "They did." He looked toward the crowd. "They also chose each other every ordinary day." He paused. "I think that's harder." I understood exactly what he meant. Grand gestures make beautiful memories. Ordinary days reveal real love. That evening, I returned to my room earlier than usual. The old curtains swayed gently beside the open window. Only a week ago they had represented fear. Now they reminded me of beginnings. Funny how quickly objects change once our hearts begin changing with them. Before sleeping, I looked through the photographs on my camera. The sunrise, the repaired fence, the lighthouse, books scattered across a wooden table. One unexpected picture made me stop. I hadn't realized I had taken it. Silas stood on the beach, looking toward the ocean instead of the camera. The wind moved his hair. The setting sun painted soft gold across his face. He wasn't smiling. He simply looked peaceful. For reasons I couldn't explain, it became my favorite photograph. Outside, waves continued their endless conversation with the shore. Inside, another conversation quietly continued inside my heart. I was beginning to trust someone again, and that frightened me almost as much as it gave me hope. Because somewhere deep inside, a small voice still whispered the same painful warning. Everyone leaves. The question wasn't whether Silas would. The question was whether I'd let myself care enough for it to hurt if he did. Some mornings arrive so quietly that they seem almost afraid to disturb the peace. That Monday began exactly that way. The ocean shimmered beneath a clear blue sky, and sunlight spilled through the windows of the guest house as if the storms had never existed. The town felt lighter. Children rode bicycles along the boardwalk. Shop owners opened their doors with cheerful greetings. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell echoed softly across the water. For the first time in years, I woke without immediately remembering what had once broken me. Instead, my first thought was simple. I wondered whether Silas would stop by for coffee. That realization made me linger in bed for another minute, staring at the ceiling with a smile I couldn't explain. Felt dangerous. Not because anything had happened between us. Nothing had. We had never spoken about romance. Never crossed any invisible line. We were simply two lonely people who had somehow become part of each other's ordinary days. And yet, ordinary days have a quiet way of becoming extraordinary before anyone notices. When I walked downstairs, Silas was already sitting on the front porch with 2 paper cups balanced beside him. "I wasn't sure when you'd wake up," he said. "So I bought both." "You assumed I'd want coffee?" "I hoped." I accepted the warm cup. "That's different." He smiled. "I've learned hope usually tastes better." We carried our drinks toward the beach. Neither of us hurried. The tide rolled gently onto the sand while seabirds drifted overhead. Silas skipped a small stone across the water. "I've always wondered something." "What?" "Why do people apologize for needing time?" I looked at him. "They shouldn't." "No." He shrugged. "If someone says they need space to heal, isn't that one of the bravest things they can admit?" His words settled quietly inside me. He had no idea how deeply they reached. Perhaps healing wasn't about pretending the wound had disappeared. Perhaps it was simply allowing someone to know it still existed. The afternoon passed peacefully. I spent several hours editing photographs in the lounge while Silas repaired loose boards along the guesthouse porch. Every now and then one of us looked up. Our eyes met. A small smile followed. Nothing more. Nothing needed to. Mrs. Harper eventually laughed. "You two hardly talk anymore." Silas looked confused. "We've talked all day." She folded her arms. "You've spoken maybe 20 words." Silas glanced toward me. "I guess she's right." I smiled. "I don't think silence counts as empty conversation." Mrs. Harper shook her head with a knowing grin. "That's usually how the important friendships begin." Neither of us answered, but neither of us argued. Late that afternoon, I decided to drive into town to buy a new memory card for my camera. The electronics shop stood beside a small cafe where tourists often gathered. I had just stepped out of my car when someone called my name. "Rowan." The voice stopped me before I even turned around. A voice I hadn't heard in nearly 4 years. A voice that still lived somewhere inside every painful memory. Slowly, I looked back. Grant Holloway stood on the opposite sidewalk. He looked older than I remembered. The sharp confidence he once carried had softened into quiet exhaustion. His dark jacket hung loosely over tired shoulders. There were faint lines around his eyes that hadn't existed before. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The sounds of the busy street seemed to disappear. I wasn't standing in Seabrook anymore. I was back in the apartment where we'd once planned a future together. Back to the promises. Back to the unanswered messages. back to the silence that followed. Grant crossed the street carefully. I can't believe it's really you. I couldn't find my voice. I've thought about this moment 1,000 times. I haven't. The words escaped more sharply than I intended. He nodded slowly. I deserve that. Silence settled between us. I heard you were living on the coast now, he said. I wasn't sure. How? A mutual friend. I sighed. Of course. Grant looked down before speaking again. I owe you an apology. You owed me 1 year ago. I know. His voice broke slightly. I wasn't brave enough back then. I folded my arms. So what changed? I finally got tired of pretending I wasn't the reason everything fell apart. The honesty surprised me. Not enough to erase the past, but enough to make me listen. I hurt you, he continued. I told myself leaving quietly would make things easier. His eyes filled with regret. It only made me a coward. I stared at the pavement. There had been a time when hearing those words would have meant everything. Now they simply sounded late. Very late. I'm sorry, he whispered. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect a conversation. He stopped. I needed you to know I never stopped feeling guilty. I took a slow breath. I appreciate the apology. He looked hopeful. But it doesn't change what happened. His shoulders lowered slightly. I understand. He reached into his pocket. If you ever want to talk. He handed me a small business card. My number hasn't changed. I accepted it without looking. Not because I planned to call. Because refusing felt cruel. Grant gave one final nod before quietly walking away. I remained standing there long after he disappeared into the crowd. Some ghosts don't knock before returning. They simply appear on ordinary afternoons and remind you how unfinished certain chapters still feel. By the time I returned to the guest house, the sky had darkened with approaching rain. Silas was sitting on the porch steps sanding a wooden chair. He looked up immediately. There you are. His smile faded when he saw my face. What happened? Nothing. He didn't believe me. You look like someone just reopened an old wound. I looked away. It was just a strange day. Silas placed the sandpaper aside. You don't have to tell me. His voice remained gentle. But you don't have to hide it either. For several seconds I almost spoke. The words reached my throat. Grant. The apology. The years. Everything. Instead, fear won again. I'm just tired. He nodded once. If that's all you can say today. He stood. Then that's enough. He walked back toward the workshop without another question. Watching him leave filled me with unexpected guilt. Not because he was angry, because he respected my silence. Sometimes kindness hurts more than disappointment. Over the next few days, Grant appeared twice more in town. Always by coincidence. Or at least that's what I wanted to believe. The second time we spoke longer. He asked about work. I asked where he'd been. He admitted he had spent years moving from city to city, never staying anywhere long enough to build another serious relationship. I kept thinking I could outrun regret. He smiled sadly. Turns out it runs faster. I listened quietly, not because I wanted him back, because I wanted to understand the ending I had never received. Unfortunately, understanding has a way of looking suspicious from the outside. One rainy evening, Silas drove past the cafe just as Grant and I were finishing our conversation. Grant shook my hand before leaving. At that exact moment, Silas's truck slowed near the curb. Our eyes met through the rain-speckled windshield. He didn't stop. He simply continued driving. Something inside me tightened. The following morning, everything felt different. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Silas still smiled. But it arrived a second later than usual. He still asked how I slept. But his voice sounded quieter. He still joined me for coffee. Yet somehow the silence between us no longer felt peaceful. Felt careful. As though both of us were trying not to step on invisible glass. Finally, I spoke. Are you okay? He looked toward the ocean before answering. Can I ask you something instead? Of course. The man at the cafe. I swallowed. What about him? Who is he? There it was. The question I had been avoiding. My ex. Silas remained still. Oh. He came here unexpectedly. I see. He apologized. Silas nodded slowly. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally he asked, "Do you still love him?" The question landed softly. No accusation. No jealousy. Only quiet uncertainty. I looked down at my untouched coffee. I don't know what I feel. That wasn't entirely true. I knew I didn't love Grant anymore. But I also knew old pain has a strange habit of disguising itself as unfinished emotion. Silas accepted my answer with a gentle smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Thank you for being honest." He stood up. "I should get back to work." As he walked away, I wanted to stop him, to explain, to tell him he wasn't losing me, that I simply hadn't figured out how to let go of my past without first understanding it. But the words never came. Sometimes silence protects us. Sometimes it quietly steals everything we're afraid to lose. That evening, as rain once again touched the windows of room 12, I noticed the old curtain. People often imagine heartbreak as something loud. A slammed door. A final argument. A voice raised high enough to drown out every good memory that came before it. But the deepest heartbreak rarely arrives that way. Sometimes it slips quietly between two people who care about each other. Not through anger, not through cruelty, but through the slow, invisible distance created by words left unspoken. That was exactly how it began with Silas and me. After our conversation on the porch, life at the guest house continued as though nothing had changed. The ocean still greeted the shore each morning. Mrs. Harper still baked fresh bread before sunrise. The lighthouse still watched patiently over the cliffs. Everything looked the same, only we were different. Silas still stopped by almost every day. He still repaired loose boards, painted window frames, and helped Mrs. Harper with whatever needed fixing. Whenever our paths crossed, we smiled politely. We talked, but never for long. The easy rhythm we had shared was gone. Every conversation felt as though it ended one sentence too early. Every goodbye arrived a little too quickly. I told myself he simply needed time. The truth was much harder to admit. I was the one creating the distance. Because every time I looked at him, I remembered his question. "Do you still love him?" I had answered honestly, but not completely. And half-truths have a way of becoming walls. A few days later, Grant called. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, I answered. "I won't keep you long," he said. "I just wanted to return something." "What?" "A box." I frowned. I found it while moving. Inside were photographs from years ago. Letters. A notebook. "Some of your things." I closed my eyes. "I thought you threw everything away." "I couldn't." His voice sounded tired. "I know I don't deserve another chance. I'm not asking for one. I only want to give you back what belongs to you." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him one final time. Not because I wanted him back. Because I wanted to close a chapter that had remained unfinished for far too long. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. Grant was already waiting with a small cardboard box resting beside his chair. He stood when he saw me. "Thank you for coming." I nodded. Neither of us smiled. He pushed the box across the table. I never opened it again. Inside lay photographs from happier days. Movie tickets. Birthday cards. A seashell we had picked up during our first vacation together. I stared silently at the memories. They no longer felt like pieces of my life. They felt like pages from someone else's story. Grant watched carefully. I used to believe forgetting someone meant throwing everything away. He looked toward the window. I've learned memories don't disappear that easily. Before I could answer, the cafe door opened. Silas stepped inside. He had probably come for his usual afternoon coffee. His eyes found mine almost immediately. Then they moved to the box. To Grant. To the photographs scattered across the table. For one painful second, no one moved. Grant looked between us. "You must be Rowan's friend." Silas gave a polite nod. "I was." The words were soft, almost impossible to hear, but I heard them, every syllable. Before I could explain, Silas quietly turned around and walked back outside. I stood so suddenly my chair nearly tipped over. "Silas." He didn't stop. Rain had already begun falling. By the time I reached the sidewalk, his truck was pulling away. Its red taillights disappeared into the gray afternoon, leaving me standing alone in the rain. That evening I sent him a message. "You misunderstood." No reply. An hour later. "Can we talk?" Nothing. The following morning. "Please." Silence. Silence can be louder than any argument. Each unanswered message echoed inside me. Not because he owed me a response. Because I suddenly understood how helpless he must have felt watching me sit across from the man who had once broken my heart. The days that followed became strangely empty. Breakfast felt quieter. The beach seemed wider. Even the ocean sounded distant. Mrs. Harper noticed first. "Where's Silas?" "I don't know." "That's unusual." I forced a smile. "He's probably busy." She looked unconvinced. "So are you." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "You've been staring out that window for nearly 20 minutes. I hadn't even realized it." Meanwhile, somewhere across town, Silas buried himself in work. Old fences, cabin roofs, kitchen cabinets. Anything that kept his hands busy enough to silence his thoughts. But work can only distract the body. The heart continues speaking. Every evening he returned to the small cottage he rented near the lighthouse. He brewed coffee, sat beside the window, and looked toward the road leading to the guesthouse. He never drove there. Not once. Because loving someone also means respecting the choices they make. Even when those choices break your own heart. One rainy night, Silas pulled a notebook from his desk drawer. The first page remained blank for several minutes. Finally, he began writing. "Rowan, I don't know whether this letter will ever reach you. Maybe it shouldn't. Maybe some feelings are kinder when kept private. When I first stepped out from behind that curtain, I thought the worst part of my week was embarrassing myself. I was wrong. The hardest part has been walking away from someone who slowly became the safest part of my days." He stopped writing, folded the paper, placed it inside a drawer. He never mailed it. I had no idea the letter existed. Instead, I spent my evenings rereading our old text messages. There weren't many. Simple conversations. Photographs of sunsets. Bad jokes. Small moments. Ordinary things. Funny how ordinary memories become priceless once they stop happening. Naomi arrived unexpectedly the following weekend. She hugged me before I even reached the front door. "You look terrible." "Nice to see you too." "I mean emotionally." She stepped inside. "What happened?" I hesitated. Then, for the first time, I told someone everything. The curtain. The bookstore. The lighthouse. Grant. The cafe. Silas leaving. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, she asked one simple question. "Did you ever tell Silas why you met Grant?" "No." "Why not?" "I thought he'd understand." Naomi sighed gently. "Rowan." "What?" "Understanding isn't something we imagine. It's something we give people." I looked down. He saw exactly what I saw. "What do you mean?" "If our places had been switched." She leaned forward. "And you walked into a cafe to find Silas smiling across a table from someone who once shattered his heart." She paused. "What would you have believed?" The answer arrived immediately. Exactly what Silas had believed. That realization stayed with me long after Naomi went to bed. The next morning I drove to Silas's cottage. No truck. No lights. His elderly neighbor smiled kindly. "Looking for Silas?" "Yes." "He's been working out near the old marina all week." I thanked her and drove there. He wasn't at the marina, nor the workshop, nor the bookstore. Each place ended with the same answer. He just left. It felt as though life itself was keeping us one step apart. Several evenings later, I returned to the lighthouse alone. The wind carried the smell of rain across the cliffs. This had once been our favorite place. Now it felt painfully empty. I sat on the same weathered bench where we had shared sandwiches while watching the sunset. Everything around me looked unchanged. Only one person was missing. For the first time in years, tears came without warning. Not because I had lost Grant. That chapter had ended long ago. I cried because I had finally found someone who made silence feel peaceful. And through fear, hesitation, and my own inability to explain the truth, I was losing him too. As the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon, I whispered words the wind carried away before anyone else could hear them. "I'm sorry." There was no answer. Only waves crashing gently against the rocks below. Sometimes the worst kind of silence isn't created because people stop caring. It's created because both hearts are quietly waiting for the other to speak first. And somewhere beyond that silence, hidden where neither of us could yet see it, the truth was patiently waiting for its chance to be heard. There comes a moment when the heart grows tired of carrying questions. Not because the answers have become easier, but because the weight of uncertainty finally becomes heavier than the truth itself. For me, that moment arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Rain had disappeared, leaving the town washed clean beneath a bright autumn sky. Sunlight sparkled across the ocean, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine through the open windows of the guest house. Everything around me looked hopeful. Inside, I still felt lost. I had stopped counting the days since Silas and I last spoke. The silence between us had become another piece of furniture in my life. Always there. Always impossible to ignore. Mrs. Harper was humming softly while arranging flowers in the dining room when Naomi walked in holding her phone. Her expression was different. Focused. Almost troubled. "Rowan," she said quietly. "I think you need to see something." I looked up. "What is it?" She sat across from me and placed the phone on the table. "I wasn't looking for this." The screen showed Grant's social media page. A recent photograph. Below it was a conversation in the comments. One message caught Naomi's attention immediately. A friend had jokingly written, "Looks like your little plan worked after all." Grant had replied only a few minutes later. "I only wanted Rowan to remember what we had." I didn't expect his carpenter friend to walk in at the perfect moment. My stomach tightened. Naomi opened another screenshot. Grant continued explaining the situation to someone else through private messages. Seeing Rowan with that guy scared me. I thought if I reminded him of our past, maybe I'd still have a chance. The room seemed to fall silent. Mrs. Harper slowly lowered the flowers she had been holding. Naomi looked at me gently. "I don't think the meeting was as accidental as he claimed." For several seconds I couldn't breathe. I remembered every coincidence, every unexpected encounter, every perfectly timed conversation. The cafe, the photographs, the moment Silas had walked through the door. None of it felt accidental anymore. I drove into town without saying another word. Grant's office occupied the second floor of a renovated brick building overlooking the harbor. The receptionist smiled politely. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. I really need to speak with Grant." A few moments later, he stepped into the hallway. His expression changed the instant he saw my face. "Rowan, we need to talk." He nodded quietly and led me into his office. The door closed behind us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed Naomi's phone on his desk. "I know." Grant stared at the screen. His shoulders slowly slumped. "I was hoping you'd never see that." "Is it true?" He closed his eyes. "Yes." The single word hurt far more than I expected. "You planned those meetings." "I didn't plan everything. You manipulated enough." "I was desperate." His voice cracked. "I saw you laughing with him. He made you smile in ways I hadn't seen before. So you decided to ruin it?" "I thought." He stopped. "I thought if you remembered us, you'd choose me." He nodded weakly. "I know how selfish that sounds." "It doesn't sound selfish." My voice remained calm. "It sounds cruel." Tears filled his eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you again." "You didn't just hurt me." I looked directly at him. "You hurt someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong." Grant covered his face with both hands. "I've hated myself every day since." I believed him. Regret filled every word. But regret could not erase what had already happened. "I hope someday you forgive yourself," I said quietly. "But that's no longer my responsibility." I turned toward the door. "Rowan." I stopped. "I'm truly sorry." This time I believed those words too. Sometimes people change. Sometimes they sincerely regret the damage they've caused. But healing doesn't always mean returning. Sometimes healing means finally walking away without anger, without revenge. Simply because the chapter has ended. I left the office without looking back. Only one thing mattered now: finding Silas. Mrs. Harper smiled the moment I rushed through the guesthouse door. "I know where he is." "You do?" She nodded. "The old lighthouse restoration project. He volunteers there every Wednesday." I didn't even wait to finish my coffee. The road leading to the lighthouse wound through tall cedar trees glowing gold beneath the afternoon sun. Every mile felt longer than the last. Questions crowded my mind. Would he listen? Would he believe me? Had I waited too long? By the time I reached the cliffs, my hands were trembling. The lighthouse stood proudly against the endless blue sky. Fresh paint covered one side of the building. Nearby, Silas knelt beside a stack of weathered wooden boards, carefully measuring each one before cutting. He didn't notice me at first. For a moment, I simply watched him. The quiet concentration, the familiar flannel shirt, the gentle patience in every movement. Then he looked up. Our eyes met. He slowly placed the measuring tape on the ground. "Hi, Rowan." His voice carried no anger, only quiet surprise. "Hi." Neither of us moved. The wind filled the silence between us. Finally, I stepped closer. "I know the truth." He frowned slightly. "What truth?" "Grant planned everything." I explained. The messages, the comments, the manipulation, the confession. Silas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he looked toward the ocean for several seconds. I wondered. "You did." He nodded. "Something about it never felt right." "Then why didn't you ask me?" A faint smile crossed his face. "I thought if you wanted me to know." He looked back at me. "You would tell me." The words carried no blame, only sadness. "I should have. You were hurting. So were you." He laughed softly. "I guess we were trying so hard to protect ourselves that we ended up protecting ourselves from each other." We both smiled. It was the first genuine smile we had shared in weeks. I looked down at the weathered wooden boards beneath our feet. "I owe you more than an explanation." Silas remained silent. Taking a slow breath, I finally said the words I had hidden for years. "When Grant left." My voice shook. I stopped believing people stayed. I swallowed hard. "He didn't just end a relationship. He changed the way I saw everyone." Silas listened carefully. "I started expecting disappointment before happiness. I trusted fear more than kindness." My eyes filled with tears. "When you asked whether I still loved him, I looked away. I didn't know how to answer, because I didn't love him. I loved the version of myself that still believed promises lasted forever." The wind carried my words across the cliffs. Silas stepped a little closer. "Rowan." I was terrified. "I know." "No." I shook my head. "You don't." "I wasn't afraid of losing Grant. I was afraid of needing someone again." Silas's eyes softened. "I've been there." He sat on one of the wooden beams. After a long pause, he spoke. "When I was 24. He smiled sadly. "I was engaged." I blinked. "You were." He nodded. "We'd been together for 5 years. What happened?" "He died." The world around us seemed to stop. "A drunk driver." His voice remained calm, but the grief beneath it was unmistakable. "I survived the accident. He didn't." I couldn't find words. "For a long time," Silas continued, "I believed loving someone again would somehow betray his memory." He looked toward the lighthouse. "Grief convinced me my heart had already lived its only story." He smiled faintly. Then one rainy afternoon, his eyes met mine. I accidentally fell asleep behind a curtain. Despite everything, we both laughed. A quiet laugh. A healing laugh. The kind that only arrives after tears. The sun began sinking toward the horizon, covering the cliffs in warm golden light. Neither of us hurried to leave. Silas reached into his toolbox and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote this weeks ago." "The letter." He looked surprised. "How did you know?" "I didn't." He handed it to me. "You can read it later." I almost threw it away. "I'm glad you didn't." I carefully slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I looked at him. "I don't expect everything to be fixed today. Neither do I. I only know one thing." "What's that?" I smiled through tears. "I'm tired of letting fear make decisions for me." Silas stood. "So am I." For a quiet moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without dramatic promises or hurried declarations, he opened his arms slightly. Not demanding, simply offering. I stepped forward. Our embrace was gentle, unhurried. Two people who had spent far too long carrying invisible burdens finally allowing themselves to put them down. The lighthouse stood silently above us. The ocean stretched endlessly before us. And somewhere between the waves, the wind, and the fading sunlight, something inside both of us began to heal. But because neither of us had to face it alone anymore. It doesn't appear one morning like sunlight breaking through clouds, suddenly making everything warm again. Healing is quieter than that. It hides inside ordinary days. Inside cups of coffee shared without hurry. Inside long walks where silence no longer feels frightening. Inside small promises that are never spoken aloud because they are already being kept. 3 months passed after our conversation at the lighthouse. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. The cedar trees surrounding Seabrook Guesthouse wore shades of gold and deep amber before finally surrendering their leaves to the wind. The ocean became calmer, reflecting pale winter skies that stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. I had planned to stay only one weekend. Instead, I rented a small cottage overlooking the harbor. Work continued remotely. My camera slowly filled with photographs that no longer captured loneliness. Instead, they captured moments. Real moments. A lighthouse glowing beneath the first snowfall. Mrs. Harper laughing while flour dust covered her apron. The old bookstore cat sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. And Silas, sometimes repairing a porch. Sometimes reading beneath an oak tree. Sometimes simply standing beside the sea with his hands in his pockets, watching another sunset. I never asked him to pose. The best photographs never needed permission. Life found its own gentle rhythm. Every Saturday morning, we visited the farmer's market before stopping at the bakery. The woman behind the counter no longer asked what we wanted. She already knew. 2 coffees. 1 cinnamon roll. 1 blueberry muffin. Silas always claimed he preferred the muffin, then quietly stole half of my cinnamon roll anyway. "You planned this." "I absolutely did. You should feel guilty." "I don't." His smile remained impossible to argue with. Some mornings began with laughter. Others began with comfortable silence. Both felt equally precious. One chilly afternoon, we finished repairing the old bench overlooking the cliffs. Silas stepped back to admire our work. "It'll probably last another 20 years. I ran my hand across the smooth wood. "You always say that." "Because I build things to stay." The words settled softly between us. He wasn't talking about the bench anymore. Neither was I. Without thinking, I slipped my hand into his. He looked down for a moment before gently tightening his fingers around mine. No dramatic music. No audience. No grand confession. Just 2 people standing beneath a gray winter sky. Sometimes love speaks most clearly through the quiet decision not to let go. December arrived with colder winds. The guest house held its annual holiday gathering for the town. The dining room glowed with candles and evergreen decorations. Children decorated cookies. Neighbors exchanged handmade gifts. Someone played old Christmas songs on a worn piano near the fireplace. Mrs. Harper insisted everyone write one wish on a small paper star before hanging it on the tree. "What did you write?" Silas asked. "If I tell you, it won't come true." "I don't believe that." "I know." "So?" I smiled. "No." He laughed. "What about yours?" He looked toward the tree. "I wished for more ordinary days." "That's all." He nodded. "I spent years believing life had to be extraordinary to matter." He glanced at me. "It doesn't. I've learned ordinary days become extraordinary when you spend them with the right person." I couldn't answer. Not because I disagreed. Because my heart was already saying everything words couldn't. A week before Christmas, Naomi returned to visit. She looked at Silas, then at me. Finally, she folded her arms. So, she smiled knowingly. You both look happier. Silas laughed. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with functioning eyesight. We all laughed together. Later, while Silas helped Mrs. Harper carry decorations into the attic, Naomi nudged my shoulder. You know, I haven't seen you this peaceful in years. I looked toward the kitchen doorway where Silas was carefully balancing a box of ornaments. I don't think he fixed me. Naomi smiled. He wasn't supposed to. I nodded slowly. I paused. He simply reminded me that I was never as broken as I believed. She squeezed my arm. The right people usually do. A few days later, snow began falling for the first time that winter. Tiny white flakes drifted quietly across the beach. Silas called early that morning. Put on your boots. Why? No questions. 20 minutes later, we stood outside the guest house. Mrs. Harper handed us an old wooden sled. I found it in storage. You two look like you could use an adventure. Silas laughed. We're probably too old for this. Mrs. Harper winked. That's exactly why you should do it. We spent the afternoon laughing like children as we walked snowy hills overlooking the sea. At one point, I lost my balance and fell backward into the snow. Silas reached down to help me. Instead, I pulled him down beside me. He looked completely offended. You planned that. I absolutely did. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Snowflakes landed gently on our coats. The world felt wonderfully quiet. I used to think happiness had to be earned, I admitted. Silas turned his head toward me. What changed? You. He smiled. No, you changed. I just happened to be standing nearby. On New Year's Eve, we returned to the lighthouse. The same bench, the same cliffs, the same endless ocean. Only this time, everything felt different. I brought something, Silas said. He reached into his jacket pocket and handed me another folded piece of paper. It was the letter, the one he had written weeks before. I think you're finally ready to read it. I unfolded it carefully. Every word carried the quiet honesty I had come to know so well. There were no dramatic promises, no impossible declarations, only simple truths, that he admired my kindness even when I couldn't see it, that my laughter had slowly become his favorite sound, that he never expected perfection, only honesty. By the time I reached the final sentence, tears blurred the page. It read, If life ever gives us another ordinary morning together, I hope we never take it for granted. I folded the letter carefully. You really never stopped believing in us. Silas looked toward the sea. I believed in you. There was a difference. The first morning of the new year arrived clear and bright. Without saying anything, we walked together toward Seabrook Guesthouse. Mrs. Harper greeted us warmly before disappearing into the kitchen, pretending she had important work to do. She knew exactly why we had come. We climbed the familiar staircase. Room 12 stood exactly as I remembered. The fireplace, the rocking chair, the old wooden floor, the wide window overlooking the ocean, and beside it, the long blue curtain. I walked toward it slowly. Months earlier, that curtain had hidden a frightened stranger. It had also hidden my own fear. Silas joined me beside the window. Funny, isn't it? What is? I spent so long thinking this room was where everything went wrong. He smiled gently. It was actually where everything began. I reached for the edge of the curtain. For a brief moment, I simply held the fabric in my hand, remembering the fear, the misunderstanding, the apologies, the conversations, the laughter, the tears, the long road back to trust. Then, with a slow breath, I pulled the curtain completely open. Morning sunlight flooded the room. Golden light spilled across the wooden floor, warming every quiet corner. The ocean shimmered beyond the glass, calm and endless beneath the winter sky. I looked at Silas. He smiled the same gentle smile that had first made me question whether kindness could still exist in the world. This time, I didn't question it. I believed it. Because trust isn't built in extraordinary moments. It's built through hundreds of ordinary ones. through showing up, through listening, through staying. I slipped my hand into his once more. He squeezed it gently. Neither of us needed to say anything. The silence between us had finally become what it was always meant to be. Home. As we left the room together, I looked back one last time. The curtain moved softly in the morning breeze. Not as a warning, not as a reminder of fear, but as a quiet symbol that every closed heart can open again, given enough patience, honesty, and love. Some people enter our lives by accident. Others remain because they choose to stay. And sometimes the greatest love story doesn't begin with perfect timing or grand promises. Sometimes it begins with an awkward misunderstanding, a kind apology, and two lonely hearts brave enough to believe that tomorrow can be gentler than yesterday. If this story reminded you that hope can return, even after heartbreak, carry that feeling with you. And if you've ever found healing in an unexpected place, know that you're not alone. Somewhere, another ordinary morning may already be waiting to change your life.